Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this week's lesson, I'd like to tell you about the power of the connected passed pawns. Let's start right away with this example. It is known that if two connected passed pawns reach the third or sixth rank from White's perspective, are stronger than a rook, even though the rook theoretically is a much more valuable piece. In this simple-looking endgame, Black is up a pawn in the rook endgame. Their challenge is that the king is far away from the action in the other corner. Yet, in this position, Black is able to force a win thanks to the fact that their pawns are quite advanced and the white king is not close enough either. The correct move here is rook takes pawn, sacrificing the rook, and with that, reaching the third rank by both pawns. Even though white now is able to move away with a check in either direction, white cannot hold off these pawns. For example, if the rook goes behind the g-pawn, we would push the f-pawn. Or, if the rook would move behind the f-pawn, we would push the g-pawn, and then, after rook g8, f2, one of the two pawns at least will promote. Giving the checks from the side wouldn't help either, because the king would simply come closer towards the g-file and the checks would run out real quick. Okay, after this relatively basic example, let's move on to a classic game. This game was played by the famous Grandmaster Nimzowitsch against Kmoch in 1927. In this position, Black is a pawn up, but there are opposite-colored bishops on the board, and as so often, that makes the job to actually win or to promote that extra pawn extra hard. At the moment, the white bishop from d6 blocks the eventual advancement of Black's a-pawn on a3 quite comfortably, and the rook, of course, is blocking the b-pawn. The position is rather closed, so it's not so easy to see how can Black make progress. For example, if the Black rook tries to come around to h1, White may just play rook b1 and preventing that plan. As we can see, the Black bishop is quite useless in its current position. So let's go back to this position, where Nimzowitsch came up with an absolutely brilliant idea because he understood the power of the connected passed pawns. He played rook to b4, an amazing move. Now, if white would not capture the rook would simply come to a4 and then either to a2 or all the way to a1, followed by advancing the a-pawn. But of course, always when there is a sacrifice, the question is, what if they accept it? And that's exactly what white did. Captured the rook, and Black pushed through the a-pawn. Now, Black has actually three far advanced connected passed pawns. That's really dangerous. We saw in the previous example how even just two pawns were dangerous or stronger than a rook. Now imagine three of them. And again, the white king is far away from action, far away from getting a chance to stop those pawns. So white has no choice but at least try to get his bishop involved in holding off those pawns. And that explains white's next move, which was b5, giving up a pawn, but at least holding off black's a pawn. King captured, and now white played bishop a3. c3 followed, and the rook had to move, and black is bringing in his king, going after another pawn of white's. If white would protect that pawn, black would probably push either the b or the c pawn with a winning advantage. Let's go back. White did not even bother trying to defend the pawn, but played f4. Black captured the pawn and brought the king closer. And now came king c4, clearing the path of the d pawn, king e1 and d4. King e2. White is hoping that black would push the pawn, and then after king e3, let's say c2, white could perhaps hold off on all those dark squares. But black can play differently by playing king d5. This sets up a cute trap. If king d3, black would checkmate right away after bishop a6. In the actual game, after king d5, white played king to f3. Bishop b7. As we can see, black has all the time in the world to improve his position and further push his passed pawns when all the pieces are ideally placed. Came rook e1 and king c4 discovered check. King f2, and finally the b pawn was ready to advance. Now white seemingly got a little bit of counterplay, but not quite enough to actually change the outcome of the game. Black captured, and e6. Luckily, black has the bishop there to catch the white pawn. At this moment, white resigned in the game, because after e7, black would follow with king b3, and rook e6 simply bishop e8, and it's not hard to believe that at least one of those 4 black passed pawns will promote. A very beautiful classic game. And now let's move on. I'd like to share with you some of my own experiences when it comes to connected passed pawns. The first of those examples is a game of mine when I was on the suffering side and learned a painful lesson. A few moves earlier, when I anticipated this position, I thought I'm in extremely good shape because at this moment I will take my opponent's bishop on a5 using the pin, using the fact that the white queen on b3 is in an unprotected square. My opponent here played a very effective, seemingly simple and quiet move. That was rook to d3. With this move, the rook protects the queen, and all of a sudden, my rooks are in a fork situation. But I thought that I'll have rook d5 and counterattacking my opponent's rook. If now rook takes rook, queen takes back, and all my pieces are safe. Here is what the problem was. My opponent took the other rook, and after queen takes rook, queen takes, rook takes. He had 2 connected passed pawns. I didn't realize in time that even though one of these passed pawns hasn't even moved yet, They are so dangerous. Came a6. Now obviously I cannot move right away behind the pawn, so I had to go from d5, trying to get to a5. And here the most accurate move was what my opponent played, b4. I would have had some chances if he would have played rook a1 right away. At least I would have gotten a chance to give my rook up for the pawn and still be down an exchange, but at least my chances were a little bit better. But look what happened in the actual game. b4 came, preventing my rook from getting to a5 as well as to c5. And even if my rook goes to b5 after a7, my rook is stuck, cannot catch that a pawn. So I tried again going back to d2 and trying to get to the a file. But my opponent again didn't let that happen. I played f5, attacking the rook. Now if the rook moves from the first rank, of course that would be back rank checkmate. But naturally, international master Perini, who is a great tactician, wouldn't fall for something simple like that. And after I took the rook, he promoted the pawn. I moved out of the check. He took my bishop, and the game did not last very much longer. He won the game. A brilliant combination, brilliant technique by the late Hungarian international master Perini. Now let's look at something of a more pleasant memory from my perspective. Here is a game of mine that I played in the Hungarian Team League back in 1986 against international master Rajna. In this position, it seems that the position is rather blocked up. It's a very closed position. And because of that, white should be better, black having two bishops without much perspective. I have a beautiful knight on d4. On the other hand, black has the control of the only open file. The big dilemma seems to be, how can white make progress in this position that's so closed? And here I came up with an idea that worked out quite well because I trusted in the power of my connected passed pawns. This is what I did. I sacrificed my bishop for only 2 pawns. Of course, if black does not capture my bishop now, then I just won a pawn and probably will win quite easily. So the real question is, of course, what if black accepts? Now, in addition to getting 2 pawns for my bishop, I'm gaining a few tempos by attacking the black rooks. The rook retreated to a8 and another tempo by attacking the rook on c8. The rook better stays on the c file in the meantime to put pressure on the c5 pawn and prevent the immediate advancement of my pawn. That explains my next move, to protect my pawn on c5. Now I'm about to advance my b-pawn next. This was a tricky move by my opponent, so if I would push my c-pawn to c6, he would be able to capture that using the pin. That is why I decided to connect my rooks so both of them are on protected squares and I don't have to worry about any of these pins coming up. Followed king to d8, b6 attacking the rook, and rook c6. Of course, I was very cautious in pushing my b-pawn and allowing a blockade by the rook on c6. The only reason why I was ready to do that, because I saw that my knight coming to b5 and then to d4 will be able to chase that rook out of there, and then I can advance my c-pawn further. This is based on an important tactic that after bishop f8, which is attacking my pawn on c5 a second time, I can still play knight d4, because now after rook takes pawn on c5, knight takes e6 fork would follow. At this point, my opponent realized that he's in trouble, and he chose to give up his rook rather than the pawn on e6. Capture the rook. And now it's important to occupy the open file immediately. And rook a7 check, rook b7, rook a8. And I went after the lonely pawn on the h file. And at this moment I made an inaccuracy by capturing the pawn on h7, allowing my opponent to get some counter chance by playing bishop c4, and then after moving the king out of the pin, he managed to capture my pawn on c5. Even though I won the game, I should have played instead, in this position, immediately rook a2. So after bishop takes pawn, I immediately can use another little tactic by playing rook to a7. Now if rook takes rook, pawn takes, bishop takes, after rook takes pawn, there will be a skewer and the black bishop on a7 will be lost. If black now would play bishop to c6, then I would take the pawn with a check, and after the bishop blocks on e7, I would simply advance my h-pawn, and black would be in a lost position. A few years later, against the super grandmaster Zurab Azmaiparashvili, who used to be Garry Kasparov's second at one point, I had a very similar idea. In this position, again there is material balance, and it's a rather closed position. But remembering my game against I.M. Raina from the previous position we just saw, it immediately came to my mind to try to use the same idea and give up a piece for the two pawns to create two dangerous connected passed pawns. And here is what I did. Indeed, I sacrificed my knight, got two pawns that are connected and very dangerous. Also, it's important to notice that the black pieces are rather passive. At this moment, it may have been even more accurate to immediately move my rook from b5 to a5 and clear the road for my b-pawn. I instead played rook a6 with the idea to put pressure on the f6 pawn, tying down the black bishop on g7, preventing ideas such as bishop to h6. On the other hand, this allowed a little bit of counterplay for black, letting the rook come in to d1. Although it didn't really spoil the game. Now I recognize that the b-pawn needs to advance and move my rook out of its way by rook b to a5. My opponent followed with knight d8, king c2, and rook h1, going right after my pawn on h3. But I'm happy to advance my pawn and give up on that not very important pawn on h3. Now, of course, my knight is important, and I'm bringing it to the other side of the board. Knight d2. And here came h5. My opponent is trying to create a passed pawn and get counter chances. We traded pawns. And knight c4. Here, in addition to the idea of trying to promote my pawns, With having so many pieces around the black king, some checkmate ideas are always in the picture also. Game knight b7, rook a1. And at this moment, my opponent made a mistake, making my job easier to win the game. His best choice was to play h4, even though white has a winning position here as well. Grandmaster Azmai Parashvili played bishop to f8, attacking my pawn, allowing a nice finish to this game. I gave the check. Now if the black king goes to the d file, my rook all of a sudden would appear on d1, and then the knight on c8 would be falling. So the king moved to b8. And now try to figure out my next move. I sacrificed my rook in order to advance my pawn with a tempo, with a discovered check. Now black's position is hopeless. My opponent's last move was giving up the rook, and after I recaptured, he resigned. I hope you enjoyed these nice examples of the power of the connected passed pawns. And maybe you can also use this idea one of these days in your games. Finally, let me show you two brilliances. In this position, black is a bishop ahead. However, white has a far advanced, dangerous passed pawn. Before we go any further, try to stop for a moment and figure out the solution. How can white to move and win? The solution here is a bit surprising. Right on the first move, white uses that far advanced passed pawn as a bait to give it up in order to lure the black queen into an unfortunate position. Now white must play very forcefully, otherwise black's material advantage will dominate. The check on g1 would be inaccurate because the black king would escape through f4. The correct check is from c1. Now black has two choices, either move his king out of the check or block it by pushing the f-pawn. Let us first see what happens if the king moves out of the check. Then white would use the typical idea for similar queen endgames, using the zigzag method to advance the queen closer to the black king and queen. And once the queen is all the way on g5, the king can move to f7, and black is helpless against the checkmate threats on h4, h5, or g6. Let's go back again to this position when white gave the check on c1, and black blocks the check. White has to continue with forceful moves, that is, check. If the king moves to the h file, we'll use a similar method of advancing our queen and then playing king f7 at the end, like in the previous variation. The king had to go the other way, and we continue with the checks. And another check, and one more check. Now we realize that when the king moves to c3, white would make a skewer, and the black queen on h8 will be lost. But how about the king moving the other way, and after that same check, black blocking the check? Now, all of a sudden, a checkmate comes. Very cute, isn't it? Well, let's move to our final position in this lesson. Another brilliant example. I cannot say that this position is likely to happen anytime soon in your games. Nevertheless, the idea is very instructive. In this endgame, one of the amazing things we see is that one bishop can hold off 6 enemy pawns. Again, before we go any further, try to pause for a few minutes and figure out the winning plan. First of all, White needs to do a few well-placed checks to force the Black king into an unfortunate position. Here is the solution. Check. Black has only a single choice. Another check. Black again has only choice. And the third check. Now that the king is on a6, we can notice that the king has no moves. So the winning plan is to simply get our king around to c8 and then checkmate with the bishop. The first step to achieve this is to move the bishop to c6, making sure Black doesn't move the c-pawn, and even more importantly, that the bishop will not be in the king's way when it crosses around. The Black bishop is pretty useless. There is nothing that bishop can attack. All the white pieces are on light squares, and the bishop has absolutely no target. Therefore, all he can do is make waiting moves. At any point, if any of the black pawns advance, White would just capture that pawn and then continue with his plan. In the meantime, the White king is going around. The only thing White needs to watch out for is making sure not to step, for example, on f3 and then allow all of a sudden a black pawn to advance. So that's why the king needs to go on the long route. Black just can make waiting moves, and beautifully the White king is going towards its goal, the c8 square. And now White is ready to checkmate. A beautiful plan, isn't it? Well, I hope you enjoyed these last 2 duels, as well as learned from the examples about the connected passed pawns. Thank you for listening, and hope you'll be back next week. So long until then.